Hello and welcome to another edition of In the Trenches podcast. I'm your host, Seth Root, and with me, as always, is my close friend, Cal Davenport. Hey, Cal, how are you doing?
Great to be here. Doing well, Seth. How about you? Happy New Year too. This is our first recording since the new
Um,
year, isn't it? At least together.
yes, yes. It's the new year, and I'm doing good. We actually had our first snow in Oregon, so even though it's a dusting, so I'm a little happy about that because Christmas we didn't get it and New Year's we didn't get it, so I'm glad we have a little bit of snow. Um, but we also have with us today as our special guest, Justin Dyer, who is a professor of political science at the University of Missouri and the author of the book we're going to be talking about, C.S. Lewis on Politics and Natural Law. He's also, if I believe correctly, the editor in chief of the online website Starting Points, a great journal for those who want to know about political philosophy and politics and such. So, uh, Mr. Dyer, it's great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So wanted to start off with uh, the simple question of why did you decide to write the book about C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis was an influence on me growing up. And when I was in high school, I picked up Mere Christianity at the school library. It was public school, and we were searching through the volumes there for something to read my English class. And I saw Mere Christianity, recognized his name from the Narnia books. And I pulled it down and read it. And at the beginning of this book is a meditation on natural law theory. He begins, as you probably recall, he's invited to give a series of BBC broadcast talks explaining what Christians believe to the British people during World War II. And he decides to begin with natural law, to begin with this idea that there is a moral law. And for Lewis, there was a apologetic reason why he was doing this. He wanted to convince people that there was bad news, and because there's bad news, then there's also good news. The bad news is you violated the natural law. The good news is there is a Christian answer to our sin problem. So that's his strategic goal in those BBC broadcast talks. But as I read it, it was my first introduction to the idea of natural law and to natural law theory. And I was fascinated by it. It made a lot of sense to me. And later, as an undergraduate student, I connected that to American politics in some of my political science classes. And I had a class called Foundations of American Politics. And we read the Declaration of Independence and some of the political sermons of the founding era, and read Tocqueville and the Lincoln-Douglas debates and all of that kind of stuff. And I loved it. I was fascinated by it, but I kept seeing these themes that reminded me of Lewis's argument in Mere Christianity. I ended up going to graduate school. I studied political philosophy and public law and became a professor of American politics. And so later, thinking back on this, on how reading Lewis influenced me and really put me on a path to studying American politics, I met a guy named Micah Watson, who's a professor at Calvin College. And Micah and I had very similar experiences, and he studies American politics and teaches political thought and public law. And he also had an interest in Lewis, and reading Lewis had kind of sparked an interest in American political thought for him. The puzzle we had, though, was that Lewis was known to be apolitical in his own life. He had a reputation for not saying much or caring much about politics. He's not known to be a political thinker. He didn't have any special interest in America. He never even visited America. And so we had this apolitical English Oxford Don who didn't say much about politics and didn't really say much about America, who somehow sparked an interest that we had in American political thought. And his biographers had all said in all sorts of different ways that you don't go to Lewis to think about politics because that's not what he's interested in. And so Mike and I wanted to address that head on, and we did it through this book project where we tried to uncover the political themes in Lewis's work and the way in which his writings, both fiction and nonfiction, can actually point you toward politics and toward thinking about political philosophy and the foundations of a just political order.
content as you did, or were you expecting to make connections from more kind of
I
like
think
underlying
we
assumptions? Were you trying to kind of excavate that, or did you actually find more than you thought would be there, just right on the surface?
I think we began with the assumption that it was there. And Micah had actually written a master's thesis at Baylor University about Lewis's political thought. And so he had done a lot of work on this already. What we were trying to do was address the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom was that Lewis was apolitical and that he didn't say much about politics and didn't care much. And actually, some of this conventional wisdom comes from Lewis himself. But nonetheless, we had always read these works of Lewis and had drawn political connections from them and saw the underlying political themes in them. So part of the project was drawing that out in a systematic kind of way and trying to address the conventional wisdom in Lewis scholarship. And I say that in Lewis scholarship, but I don't think Micah or I would consider ourselves Lewis scholars at this point. A lot of times we choose book projects based on stuff we want to learn and not stuff we know. And so I always pick something I'm interested in or a question that I want to learn more about and go about a project that way. And hopefully I learn something from it and somebody else can learn from it as well when they pick it up to read it. But I always feel inadequate at the end of the project where there's still so much more to learn. And Lewis is certainly an example of that for me. And I feel like there's a lot more that I could learn about him and through his works, but it was a fun time for me to be able to just put things aside and really focus on reading through some of his writings in a serious way and trying to derive some of the political lessons from them.
One well, I have a question because, when you talk about politics, I think you mean something different than maybe how a lot of Americans view politics. I think a lot of Americans view politics in like the day-to-day, what's going to get done, what kind of legislation is going to get passed, who's going to run and who's going to win what election, that sort of thing. And in the book, you talk about a different type of politics that
Yeah.
Luke was more interested about. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think a lot of what we saw as political themes in Lewis's works were broader themes about what it means to be a human, what it means to live together with other human beings. How do we flourish in this life? What things are good for human beings and how do we achieve those goods? What does prudence require of us in our day-to-day activities? All of those things are foundational to politics, but they're not about specific policy questions. They're not about partisan maneuvering or electoral politics. And so we really do set that aside and table that in the way that Lewis tabled and set that aside in his own writings. But nonetheless, there's something deeper and broader, I think more foundational to political questions that is always there, but is never quite brought to the surface in our normal policy disputes and in our normal partisan political maneuvering. And it's a question about human nature. What are we? What kinds of beings are we? What are we made for? What's our purpose? How do we live well? What do our families require? And all of those kinds of things, Lewis actually did think quite a bit about and had a lot of interesting things to say. And so that is part of our focus. On the other hand, Lewis did say some things about specific policy questions. He had essays, and this is where he actually is more political in a policy and partisan kind of way than people often think. And then he cultivated in his own reputation. But he has essays about, well, whether there should be prayer and Bible reading in schools. He has essays about socialism, and he has essays about atomic warfare and criminal punishment and all sorts of actual specific policy kinds of things. But he's always trying to draw out some permanent question or permanent theme that would apply to human beings as such as he's thinking about some of these particular policy questions of his own time.
So, what I really liked about your book was how accessible it was to everyone. It just seemed like if I when I first came across C.S. Lewis, it was through the Narnia books at first, but then through Abolition of Man. And Abolition of Man is very hard to read. Even my friend Steve Hayward said that you can read the Abolition of Man in one sitting, but if you really want to read C.S. Lewis and understand his thought, you have to take a long time to kind of think about what he was saying. And your book really does that. It kind of explains a lot of C.S. Lewis thought. But I thought the first chapter was a little harder to read at first because you talk about creation and the fall of man. And I was wondering how that was important to C.S. Lewis and his thought. Um, it just seemed to me like it was very hard to grasp.
Yeah.
So that's why I asked you.
So it's an interesting question because you have a book on politics. It's C.S. Lewis's Political Thought, Politics and the Natural Law. And then the first chapter is about the doctrines of creation and fall of humanity. The reason we did that is because there's a debate that I think is really important to understanding Lewis, and it has political implications. And it's about the reliability of human reason, whether we can rely on humans to reason well about the world that we live in, about the goods that constitute human flourishing, about how to achieve them. And that's a debate that has significant political implications. And at the bottom of that debate is really a question of anthropology. It's a question of what we are as human beings. And I don't think there's any way getting around that, the answer to that question without talking about some theological foundational doctrines. And so for Lewis, a person who said that he believes in Christianity as he believes in the sun having risen, not because he sees it directly, but by it he sees everything else, is a man that Walter Hooper said was the most thoroughly converted man he had ever met. So somebody who really did see everything in light of these core doctrines of Christianity. And so if we were going to talk about the way that Lewis perceived or saw or approached any subject, we thought we really had to situate it within these foundational Christian doctrines, but particularly for politics and political philosophy. What is a human being? Where did they come from? What is their purpose? What reliability might we have for reason? And this actually is something that you see political theorists talk about quite a bit, and certainly not only Christian political theorists. And so we tried to situate Lewis within those broader debates within political philosophy, particularly about the question of whether the universe is created or whether it's eternal, whether human reason is reliable or whether it's not, whether it's just merely the product of evolutionary processes. And it does, for that reason, become very dense and technical very quickly in trying to wade through these theoretical debates. But then it sets up this broader question of the viability of natural law in the modern world.
Yeah, and that's where I was actually going to go next. Was what was Lewis's view of natural law, and how it differed from maybe other people's view of natural law.
There's a way in which, when you read Lewis on natural law, what he means by natural law is something like moral realism, that he believes that morality is real, that it's objective and not subjective, that it's not simply about how you feel about something or something interior to yourself, but there's an objective moral reality in the world. But then he goes beyond that, and he's not simply saying there's an objective moral reality, but he's also saying that there's an objective moral reality that is part of human nature and that can be understood by the exercise of reason. And when he says those two things, I think that takes him firmly beyond just basic moral realism and into natural law and into the camp of the natural law. Now, in terms of his own theory, he did not say anything original about natural law. And I think it would actually have horrified him if he had said anything original. He was trying to conserve a tradition. He was trying to speak from within that tradition. And I don't think he was trying to be innovative in any way in terms of how he thought about natural law. He said at one point that the highest and most beautiful expression of the natural law tradition was found in Richard Hooker. And Richard Hooker is the 17th century Anglican priest and legal theorist. And so Lewis appealed to him. Hooker was indebted to Thomas Aquinas primarily for his natural law theory. And so there was a kind of connecting point between Thomas Aquinas and his project with respect to natural law, and then Richard Hooker in England, and then the influence that Lewis derived from Hooker. And so I would put Lewis, for those who know these different camps and know a little bit about natural law theory, I would put him, I think, squarely in that line from Thomas Aquinas to Richard Hooker in terms of how he approached natural law.
If I'm not mistaken, John Locke also was influenced by Hooker and Aquinas through him. Am I right on that? So,
well, you're right on that. There's a debate among political theorists about how sincere John Locke was in his citations of Hooker, and how truly Thomistic John Locke might have been, or how much Locke was actually influenced by Thomas Aquinas. But you're right, he does appeal specifically to Hooker. You know, he talks about the judicious Hooker, I think is the phrase that Locke uses, and he cites him several times. And so there is at least a kind of intellectual tradition that goes through those different thinkers.
On that note, I'm always reminded of the late Harry Jaffa talking about the Declaration and how the pursuit of happiness was an Aristotelian notion, And I think and I think for at least for Jaffa that he thought Locke came from, you know, the Aquinas
Yeah.
and Aristotle. But not a lot of Straussians say no probably to that.
Yeah, and Jaffa always tried to make a distinction between the way that his intellectual mentor, Leo Strauss, the way that Leo Strauss read these philosophers and the way that the American founders read these philosophers. And so there may be a distinction, and I think Jaffa tried to make a distinction between what was Locke saying and what did the American founders think Locke was saying, and how did that influence what they were doing. And so there might be, for the attentive reader, there might be a distinction that makes a difference in those things. But certainly for the American founding, it's a question that occupies people for whole careers. But how do you blend these sources, and are they compatible, and what does that look like? But Thomas Jefferson has that famous letter where he talks about the American mind as being watered by these streams that come from Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney, and these other elementary books of public right, I think, as he phrases it. And you have that question, Aristotle and Cicero, an ancient Greek theorist, an ancient Roman, and then two 17th century Englishmen, Locke and Sidney. How do they all go together, and are they saying the same thing? And I think that's part of the puzzle that Jaffa was addressing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, but back to your book, because I like the way you were moving the book along, and you first addressed, okay, here's C.S. Lewis's view about the natural law, and then you gave kind of a contrasting view, so to speak, in Karl Barth. And so I was wondering if you could just take us back a little bit to the early 20th century, and what exactly was the split between those two, and why Barth didn't like the natural law tradition so much.
Karl Barth was this monumentally influential 20th century Calvinist theologian. And he is writing at a certain time. There's a very famous debate in the 1930s between Emil Brunner and Karl Barth, and the Brunner and Barth debate on natural law and Calvinist theology has a big impact on theologians and the Protestant theologians in the 20th century. And their debate essentially is about whether or not nature, capital N, nature, is a normative source, normative standard for Christian ethics. And Barth's answer to that was no, that there was one revelation from God through the person of Jesus Christ, as attested to in Christian scripture. And Christian scripture and the one word of God, the person of Jesus, is the only standard of ethics in this life, and the only standard that we should appeal to. In that debate, Brunner disagreed. He tried to say that actually there'd been a place in Christian theology, including Protestant theology, for the natural law tradition for a long time. And this really came to a head then in World War II. And what Barth took away as the lesson from World War II and the lesson from Nazi Germany was that the Christian opposition to the Nazis, according to Barth, had to be founded solely on an appeal to divine revelation and to Jesus Christ. This is kind of the language that he uses and the way that he approaches it. I think Lewis's approach is very, very different, as you saw in Mere Christianity. This is a series of BBC talks that he's giving in the middle of World War II. He's trying to explain what Christians believe, and he starts with natural law as this foundational doctrine to Christianity that sets up the gospel and makes sense of it and all of this. And so they have a very serious disagreement on this. As we try to recreate this debate then between Lewis and Barth, two giants of Protestant theology, although Lewis not as a professional theologian, but as a layperson speaking about theological issues, their disagreement then helps us see these different approaches to natural law and why some Christians reject natural law on theological grounds. So Barth's position is that human reason is unreliable. He takes so seriously the doctrine of the fall that if we are fallen, then our reason can't accomplish what it was designed to do. And it is totally unreliable for us in this life, that we have to rely solely on divine revelation. Lewis disagreed with that. He thought that scripture presupposed a natural law. He found passages in scripture that he thought pointed us to that, including the famous ones that you find in some of Paul's epistles. And Lewis thought that that was an important thing that had disastrous consequences for all sorts of areas of life, including politics. And so just briefly in thinking about what are the consequences here, Lewis, he compared Barth and what he called Barthianism at one point to devil worship. And the reason he compared it to the devil worship, and these are serious words because Barth is comparing Lewis's approach to the Antichrist, right? So it's kind of uncomfortable reading these debates, these two, giants of Protestant Christianity. But Lewis's position was, look, if you don't have any notion of goodness, any innate notion of goodness, and your reason can't actually evaluate whether things are good or bad, then you don't even have the ability to evaluate the goodness or the badness of the revelation itself, for the commands coming from God. And if God's commands, or his ostensible commands that are being communicated through revelation, are not able to be evaluated on other independent grounds about their goodness, then you are forced to accept them solely because of God's superior position of power or strength. So God's sovereignty in that sense becomes only about power. So God gets what God wants, as that the old song says. And I think it was an old Pink Floyd song had a lyric that that went that way. And if God gets what he wants, and what he wants is just arbitrary, it's just arbitrary will, then Lewis said there's no distinction between that and devil worship, because devil worship's just the worship of power for its own sake. That was the position that Lewis held. It's a stark and strong position. And then, of course, Barth thinks he's a heretic for that, and that he's worshiping the Antichrist. This is a serious debate. For Lewis, though, there was an analogy between God's rule and political rule. And I think this goes back to the broader Christian tradition, where people said, no, look, you rule by both reason and goodness, that they're connected to each other. And so that your reason wills things that are good, and it's not arbitrary. And the human sovereign should do that as well. So the human sovereign should be guided by reason and should will things that are good, and good independent of what they will, that it's not simply human will, full stop. It's not the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. It's not might makes right. And that's what Lewis saw as ultimately at stake in that debate, was a conception of sovereignty, and whether there's anything that binds sovereignty or whether it's simply unbounded. And he saw the problem with fascism, the problem with Nazism, the problem with communism, and ultimately the problem with democracy as relying on a notion of sovereignty that was completely unbounded, and that the only source or standard for what we should do as a society was what we wanted to do, or what those who were in power wanted to do. And that's what he thought would cause the death of our civilization, and why he so adamantly tried to point people back to the natural law.
I feel like a lot of Christians today, or Christianity today, I think, especially in the evangelical movement, are more susceptible to the Karl Barth view, which
Yeah.
is why when I read this book, I was kind of taken aback about that part, about talking about God's goodness, and here is C.S. Lewis saying in essence that God must act according to some type of reason and an eternal law that is not solely by his will. I'm going to change slightly my question here, and that is, what do you think, especially in the evangelical movement, has to do to kind of get away a little bit of that? Because in my opinion, it seems to me C.S. Lewis had the better argument here. What must the evangelical movement do to try and separate themselves a little
There's
bit?
been a lot of rethinking of this question in evangelical theology and political philosophy recently. Micah Watson, the co-author in the book, has been part of this. He's teaching at Calvin College, and he's worked with colleagues at other evangelical schools to start thinking about this. They have a volume devoted to natural law and evangelical political thought, edited volume of essays. And there has been some really good work by people coming out of places like, you're in Grand Rapids. I'm trying to think now, the think tank right there in Grand Rapids, the Acton Institute.
Yeah, Acton. Yeah, we've had Samuel Gregg on the podcast a few times, the research director there.
Yeah, Samuel Gregg. Stephen Grable there had done some really good work. One of those was a book about rediscovering natural law and reformed theological ethics. And there have been several other volumes. John Whitty at Emory Law School is doing good work on this. And so there are several people who have written really in the last 20 years or so, written a lot about this. And so I think probably in terms of intellectual currents, things are moving in a different direction, and there's been a rethinking of some of these questions. But it does look, I think, if you look at the broader tradition, the 20th century looks like the outlier to me in terms of Protestant theology and this wholesale rejection of natural law that happened. And there was a resurgence of natural law thinking after World War II in particular, because of what was going on in the war, because of the Nuremberg trials, because of all of the kinds of questions surrounding universal human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so there was a re-engagement by Catholic philosophers after the war, but also Protestant theologians after the war. And then there was also an ecumenical movement, so that Orthodox, Catholic, and evangelical scholars and theorists have been talking together a lot about these kinds of questions. So I see all of those movements as things that are positive and moving in a positive direction.
Yeah, that whole discussion too, not to take us too far off of the path, but it reminds me of the Bart Lewis debate. Reminds me of Christ's temptation in the wilderness, because you've got on two levels, and because you've got on the one hand Satan himself quoting scripture literally for the most part, with maybe a little bit of manipulation, but obviously out of context. So there's this idea that you can potentially appeal directly to scripture and get something totally wrong out of it. And then at the same time, how much of this revolves around power, both as being offered by Satan and also as part of his desire to have power over Christ in this situation. And I can see this line drawn directly to Lewis. But this also reminds me a bit of the parable, I guess you could call it, from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and the Grand Inquisitor, of it being a question of sort of offering the power of the world to solve problems, and Christ's rejection of this, of power in that situation. And just seeing that contrast, and I think it's easy to read this on the surface as a criticism from Russian Orthodoxy towards Catholicism in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but also as applying potentially to misinterpretations from the Protestant side. So I'm connecting a lot of dots there, and I don't exactly have a question, but it's interesting to kind of pull back with this debate in mind to look at how all of these ideas are connected.
Yeah, I think there's a broader question there of tradition, of the authority of tradition. This is obviously one of the big debates between Protestants and Catholics often, is how do you approach Christian tradition and the authority of tradition. But Lewis was, in his own way, a very, heterodox would be the wrong word, but idiosyncratic maybe. I think he was very comfortable drawing from a variety of different traditions. He was very comfortable affirming some doctrines that his own Church of England did not affirm. And he saw himself as part of a broader Christian tradition that had authority, but not in the exact same way that the Catholic Church would have claimed authority. And so he remained an Anglican for his entire life. But he did have a certain approach to Christianity that he desperately wanted to call mere Christianity, which is what you get in the title of the book. And there are all sorts of debates continually about whether such a thing actually exists, whether there is any such thing as mere Christianity. But Lewis certainly wanted that to exist and wanted to try to refine how we approached that. One thing that dawned on me as we were talking, though, is that the theological questions are important to understanding how Lewis approached natural law. But within natural law, we could make a distinction between epistemology and ontology, or between how we know something and what it is in itself. And the how we know is you might get a different answer from what it actually is and where it comes from. And so Lewis would say that if we understood human nature and we understood natural law and where it comes from, there is a lawgiver, and there's no law without a lawgiver. God plays a prominent role. On the other hand, part of the promise of natural law is that you don't have to have a worked out ontology about where it is for it to be real, and for the reality of the natural law to bear on our experiences in the world. And so even people who don't believe in God or have a different conception of God still nonetheless have access to the natural law via their common human nature and through the use of their reason. And so one of the promises of natural law is that it gives you a basis for politics that actually is not founded on theological claims, or at least not founded on ecclesiastical claims or a right to rule based on ecclesiology. And so you do have, that interesting contrast, actually. It's the robust theological understanding of natural law and where it comes from that is precisely what gives Lewis the position of being able to have common citizenship that includes people from different religious faiths and doesn't depend on any confessional kind of state.
I wanted to move on to you talk about the modern philosophers like Machiavelli, Rousseau, Hobbes, and how they kind of destroyed that medieval ancient view of man, which led um uh Lewis to kind of go and write The Abolition of Man. So I was wanting you to talk to us about that, about what he saw in the modern philosophers that made him write that book.
Yeah, Lewis has a fascinating book that nobody reads anymore, and it's called English Literature in the 16th Century. And it was his magnum opus, his big academic work. And in that book, he actually does quite a lot on intellectual history and political theory as he's trying to understand English literature from the 16th century. And a lot of his work about people like Machiavelli comes out in that book, his academic book. And it helps to then inform how we understand the abolition of man. And so going to the abolition of man, it's an interesting little book for those who haven't read it. I do recommend it. It was put as, I think, number 7 on National Review Magazine's list of the top 100 books of the 20th century. So it's this really interesting book, and that helps draw out some of the political implications of Lewis as well. You know, how does this book end up on this conservative political magazine's list of the top 100 books of the 20th century? Lewis writes it as a review of a English language textbook for students in England. And he's given this book to review. The book is about how we use language and how we should understand language. And what the book says is that language is entirely subjective, that when you use words, you're describing things about yourself, but you're not describing things about the external world. And then he uses an example, and it's an example of this waterfall that's beautiful or sublime, and somebody who sees it and says that if we're really thinking clearly, Lewis says, or the book says, if we're really thinking clearly about it, what we're saying is that that waterfall makes me feel a certain way. You're describing your own feelings. And they would apply that across the board to all sorts of things, including ethics. And so if you say that's bad or that's good, what you're really saying is that makes me feel bad or that makes me feel good. Lewis gets this book and he decides this is a serious error that's being given to students, and they don't even know it's being given to them, and it's going to affect their entire outlook on the world. And so he devotes a series of endowed lectures at the University of Durham to taking down this book. And he calls it, he's a gentleman enough to not name the authors or the title. And so he just calls it the Green Book. And his lectures in The Abolition of Man, published together in that book, are all about why this is the wrong way to think about our words. And what he wants to recreate then is a vision of reality in which our reason can actually comprehend things that are good or true or beautiful, and that those would be objective statements about the world we live in and not merely subjective statements about ourselves. And it relies on a vision of human nature that you had talked about, this medieval or ancient view, where you have 3 different parts of a human being. And those 3 different parts of a human being or a human soul would correspond roughly to your reason, and then your passions and your appetites. And what Lewis thought was that in order to have a well-formed human being who is functioning well in the world, their reason needed to be able to side with well-trained passions or emotions in order to rule correctly and order correctly their appetites. If we couldn't do that, then there would be nothing that distinguishes us from the beasts, the animals, that we would simply just have appetites, we would have base desires, we would want things, and then our reason would scheme to help us get what we want. But they wouldn't be a source of telling us what we should want to want. There would be no such thing. At the base of everything would be desire. Well, what Lewis describes then in The Abolition of Man is the process by which man is abolished, the vision of man as a soul composite of those 3 things is abolished, because the men no longer have chests. And so he has that phrase, men without chests. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means there's no part of humanity anymore that intermediates between reason and appetite. And appetite simply dominates reason. And so reason no longer governs, appetite governs, and reason simply becomes calculating and strategic. It simply helps us get the thing that we want. And this is precisely the view of reason that you get in people like Thomas Hobbes. And so Thomas Hobbes is very explicit that that's reason's role, that reason can't tell you what you should want, that we just have certain things we want, and reason helps us get there. It's, he compares reason as the scouts and spies that range abroad and get us the things that we desire. And if that's all reason is, then we're in a hard place in our modern world, Lewis thinks. And this is his alarm bell about that philosophy, that if we're not careful, that philosophy is going to seep into art, it's going to seep into education, it's going to seep into politics, and it's going to be the death of our civilization. And he meant that quite literally. I think he really thought that.
Yeah, Hume says something very similar. I think that that reason is and can only ever be the slave of the passions, or something.
Yes, that's exactly right, and that's the view that he's responding to.
Excuse me. Pushing on, because I think that seems to be for a lot of people in the natural law tradition and such to say, okay, yeah, I get that part, but then you make a claim that even though he likes the natural law tradition, as you talked about him being very influenced about Richard Hooker, all those Aristotle, all those ancient philosophers, he then goes and takes up more of a classical liberal approach to politics. And I think you said on the Babylon Bee podcast that this was the thing that was sort of the more contested part of the book. Can you explain why you think that is, and how that differs in approaching government and such?
Sure. Yeah, as we go through these chapters, we start with these theological doctrines, and we get into these debates in the 20th century and the abolition of man, and then we pivot to some more practical, on the ground political questions, and use John Locke and John Stuart Mill to help us think through those. And the claim is that Lewis actually was quite indebted to the approach that you find from John Stuart Mill, the kind of approach, and also from John Locke. And that takes him into a very modern kind of way of approaching politics. And so how do we square that circle? I think in the ancients, you have a vision of politics that is both this vision of humanity, of what human beings are, that we just talked about from the abolition of man, but also its correspondence to a government that's structured in a hierarchical kind of way. And so you have monarchies with landed aristocracies, and you have a very rigidly ordered society. You don't have equality as a supreme value in society, and you have a vision of legislation as directing human beings toward their good. Thinking about Robbie George's old book, Making Men Moral, there's a view of legislation as trying to perfect men or make them better through legislation. The modern view looks a little bit different than that. John Locke makes equality central to his argument that we're all equal. You find that claim in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And you find in somebody like John Stuart Mill, the harm principle, the idea that government's justified in restraining your liberty only to prevent harm from occurring to someone, that the goal of legislation is not to make you a better person, that could be left to the private sphere. And so Lewis, on the one hand, sounds very ancient, where he's talking about the ancient, the medieval view of human nature. He doesn't like the modern theorists like Hume and Hobbes. On the other hand, he sounds very modern. He's talking about equality in some sense. He thinks that government should be limited. He sounds in a lot of ways like a libertarian. He's criticizing socialism. He's fearful of concentration of government power. And so how do those things come together? And that's the burden of those chapters. I think for Lewis, there is a way in which he disagrees on means and not ends with some of the ancient theorists. And it's because of the particular historical context he lives in. And it's based on a prudential calculation of what's most likely to affect human flourishing in this life, in this context, in this country at that moment. And for him, it was something like classical liberalism. That was the answer. But the crucial distinction between Lewis and someone else that might be in that same tradition is that Lewis believed in a real right and wrong. He believed in a true human good. He wasn't neutral on the question of whether there is a good. And I don't think he thought government should be neutral on that question either. He just thought the best way to actually ensure real human flourishing was to have limited government. But even that ancient approach comes out in some places. So for example, he has an essay on equality. And when he talks about equality, he praises the Declaration of Independence. He thinks it's a noble statement, but he describes the idea of political equality as a legal fiction that's designed to prevent us from being cruel to one another. And so he thinks that's good. It serves a purpose. If we say we're all equal, what we mean is that the law should treat us all equally. And the reason the law should treat us all equally is because it prevents all sorts of human cruelty one to another. But it's not actually true, he thinks, that we're all equal, that equality in other areas of life is problematic. Educational equality, aesthetic equality, all of these different areas, if you get rid of truth, you get rid of beauty, you get rid of these standards based on a vision of equality, that's really problematic for Lewis. And so you still have some of these, I think, older ideas that are coming through, even as he's trying to embrace a vision of liberalism that I think would see government's role as protecting individual rights and being limited in scope.
Well, this seems to be a little bit of a way of kind of circling back around, at least in my mind, to that first question that you discuss in your book about the creation and the fall of man, and knowing sort of, what was human nature as created and what is it after the fall. Because if I remember right, I think the essay that you're referring to is he's talking about membership in political communities or in the church, or at least he says something very similar in another lecture that he gave. But he talks about this idea of the fiction of equality, but he sees even being part of the church as restoring us to that sort of hierarchy where people are different and bring different gifts and their own uniqueness to things. And if you believe that we are close to, we can be brought back to that, to that sort of restored almost to the pre-fall state in communion with Christ, you can see how you can get from a hierarchical Anglican church to a sort of egalitarian and democratic and libertarian form of politics. And so what I'm trying to say is I can see how this is like a central question, understanding where somebody like Lewis or any other Christian thinker is coming from and thinking about the creation and the nature of man. It helps you to sort of square that circle and kind of predict where somebody would go with those thoughts.
Yeah, that we need hierarchy, that hierarchy is built into the structure and the fabric of the universe. And there is a hierarchy of, with respect to, say, beauty, that some things truly are more beautiful than others. There's a hierarchy with respect to moral goods. There's a hierarchy with respect to talents and education, and there's a real standard of excellence. And so hierarchy is something he is very much in favor of. What he's not in favor of is an artificial hierarchy that puts some people above others and creates a fiction that some people are better than others and have a right to govern because of their innate superiority. He thinks that that's actually not true. And because it's not true, it leads to all sorts of cruelty. And one way to try to guard against that is political equality, which he distinguishes from these other kinds. But he does have that line where he says that I'm a Democrat, small d, Democrat, not because I think men are so good that everyone deserves a share in government, but because I think everyone is so bad, no one should be entrusted with concentration of power in their hands. So it was a kind of prudential calculation that diffusing government authority was actually a good way to protect individual well-being. And that's based on a theological doctrine of the fall.
Now, so I think today, because I want to kind of get to in today's world, we're seeing this kind of resurgence in some quarters of the ancient kind of understanding of government. Friends like Sohrab Ahmari, the people at First Things over there, they're all trying to, and Patrick Deneen as well, they all try to bring back, I think, this older notion, this ancient notion of how government should operate. And I kind of wonder what you think C.S. Lewis would say about this moment and this resurgence, and would he caution them, or would he maybe try and find a third way, so to speak, trying to use more prudence in today's politics.
Yeah, Lewis died in 1963. He died the same day that JFK and Aldous Huxley died. And it's a really interesting question. Had Lewis lived another 40, 50 years, maybe an old man at that point? But had he lived to see some of what happened in the world, would he have approached it differently? Would he have had different thoughts? And of course, that's a question we can't answer, but it does bring up a lot of the kinds of things that he wrestled with. As far as I understand, and I'm certainly no expert on either Amari or Deneen, but I'm familiar enough with their writings and some of the arguments that they're putting forward. And what I take them to be doing, and some of the other people who are on the right making these kinds of arguments, is to push first on the anthropology question, on the how we understand human beings and what our anthropological assumptions are that go into government policy. And what they see is a liberalism that has become atomized, or individuals within liberalism that have become atomized, meaning that they are disconnected from communities, they're disconnected from families, they're disconnected from place, from obligations to certain places and communities. And so the emphasis has not been, from their quarter, has not been on maximum individual liberty, disassociated from families and other kinds of kinship ties or religious communities or church authority. And so the rethinking then is partly on the assumptions that undergird our approach to politics. And they see liberalism as having all sorts of excesses that have become problematic in our public life. I think a lot of people agree with that. Then the question is, what do you do about that? What should the right approach be? And that's the point at which I'm not sure anybody's giving real hard policy solutions right now. And so even though they are arguing that we should try to recover a vision of politics as oriented toward the common good, that's a real good, that's objective, that it's not subjective, that we should try to emphasize policies that would promote individual duties and not be so rights oriented and focused, that we should rethink our economy in a way that actually allocates resources that makes communities flourish. All of that seems well and good, but nobody, as far as I know, nobody's really arguing. And what we should also do is bring back the kingship and have a landed aristocracy that's, that is passed down through inheritance, and the firstborn inherits all the property. And we should, so I'm not sure anybody's arguing that. And it's an interesting question. I think part of what is going on in the debate is that you have some classical liberals who are saying it was not bad, the excesses came in, and try to recover the American founding, and that's our solution. And then you have others who are saying, no, the American founding is in the same stream of liberalism as progressivism, as everything else. The American founding is not going to save us. The assumptions built into it are modern. We actually need different assumptions. Let's move forward with differences. But as we do that, the million-dollar question is, well, what does that actually look like? How radical of a transformation of our system is it? And prudentially, you've got to do this with 330 million other Americans. And a lot of those people are not going to want the same kind of system that you want. How do you make decisions together? What's the common ground? What's the basis? Really, from the perspective of people who are working in political thought, it's really a matter of trying to get the foundational principles right first, and then try to think through the questions of policy. And there's a wide variety of perspectives on policy right now. On the right, as you know, it's it's kind of challenging time.
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading this book, it just felt like this was a great book for what's going on now, because I felt like C.S. Lewis, at least in some ways, can nudge us towards a kind of a prudential politics in such a way that that doesn't give up the theological understanding of man and all that, but at the same time, can still work in our system of government. And I think today, if there's certain people on the right that want to keep that theological understanding, but how that looks like in today's politics would be very radical. And
Yeah.
that's why I asked that question.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things I agree with is that politics isn't neutral. And there was for a long time, I think, what liberalism, and when we talk about liberalism, we're really meaning this long tradition, not left-right American politics binary, but we're all liberals in some sense. We're all coming from this liberal tradition from the Enlightenment. But within that tradition, you have a lot of people, particularly in the 20th century, who were saying things like, look, we disagree on what is good. And actually, there's no answer to what is good. Good doesn't exist, or it's all subjective. But what we can try to do is just find a way to live together peacefully. And we'll just be neutral on the question of good. We'll be neutral, and we'll figure out what we all want. And to the extent that there's a consensus about what we want, we'll move forward that way. And the criticism has always been that that's impossible, that actually every government policy will presuppose some notion of the good, that you just can't move forward without that. And so rather than pretend like we're neutral, why not actually stake out some claim about what the good is and try to pursue policies that instantiate the good in our politics? And in that sense, if being neutral on the good is what we mean by liberalism, then maybe making really hard claims about the good, it makes you a post-liberal. I don't know exactly what all these terms are pointing to these days, but that might be one of the things, is that we're actually entering into an era in which people drop the pretense to neutrality and they have different visions of the good. But then it takes us back to all the old questions of politics, and particularly in American politics. What do you do when you have fundamentally rival visions of the good with people who are co-citizens with you in the same common community? How do you live together then? And that's a hard question, and one that really does drive people apart over time in their communities, and one that maybe we have to just start thinking about it at the local level first and working out from there. But it's a project that every generation has to tackle on their own, and certainly we have our work cut out for us.
How does Lewis and his writing on the natural law help us to think about these things? Is there something that, in addition just to recognizing again that there are objective answers to questions about right and wrong and good and evil and things like that, how else can we apply his thoughts to the situation we find ourselves in?
I think he helps clarify questions. One of the things that Lewis does in his writings, and one of the things that I find of value in Lewis's writings, is that he helps clarify concepts, he helps clarify questions, and he helps to integrate a variety of different sources into one body of wisdom. I think he saw himself as somebody who was not saying anything new or innovative, but rather just passing on. And so that's one of the values that I found in him. You learn a lot about theory, you learn a lot about some of these fundamental political debates simply by reading his works. What does it do for us now? What's the practical takeaway? I think that it can give us a certain way to approach politics. It can help clarify some of those questions, as I had mentioned, particularly for those with Christian commitments. It helps to think about politics from a Christian perspective, but also helps you see that there's a multiplicity of Christian perspectives. And one of the things that Lewis always warned about was associating your merely human judgments with pronouncements from the Lord as a kind of blasphemy. That he gave you the natural light. You can try to work through your reason to come through certain judgments about the right way of ordering political society. You might be right or you might be wrong, but in most circumstances, you're not entitled to associate your views with the will of God. And that's something he warned people about in his time. And I think that's a warning that's probably worth paying heed to today.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think our time is up, so Justin Dyer, it's been great to talk to you about C.S. Lewis. As you know, we're both fans of C.S. Lewis, so it's great to talk to you back on to talk about more
Yeah,
stuff
thanks,
like
guys.
this.
Appreciate being on. Love the podcast. Love what you're doing.
Thank you. Signing
right.
off from the trenches.